So once again, thanks everyone for joining. This is actually the 40th meeting of the IBWG. So we've been meeting for over 10 years now. Basically, I think we missed one quarter back in 2012. So almost every single quarter we've had a meeting and have had, I think, close to 100 presentations. So thanks everyone for their continued support, and the group keeps growing. A reminder to anyone on the call, if you have topics of interest that you would like to cover in any future meeting, feel free to reach out. If you have presentations, if you have ongoing projects that you would like to get in front of our audience, you're always welcome. So just a few logistical things here. So keep yourself muted when you're not speaking. When you do have a question or comment, please, you can turn on your camera, and maybe really quick intro to who you are. Your name and organization would be helpful. Throughout the web meeting, anybody on the line, feel free to use the chat to inform the group of projects, workshops, anything of interest to the group that you'd like to share. We'll collect all of the chat and anything that's shared during the group, links, etc. And we'll have a summary document sent out to the group after the meeting. So if you have something you'd like to share, not just to this group, but to the full, I think we got about 150 people on our mailing list. You can use our chat, and we'll make sure that information gets out. And it seems to me we have a number of new attendees, so thank you very much. And an open invitation if you have other folks that you'd like to invite, other people. We want to keep this as a pretty open forum, so feel free to invite other people that you might find this group of interest. So a quick recap from our December meeting. So in December, we had the Financial Accountability Office from Ontario present on their report, the report called Estimating the Budgetary Impacts of Climate Change Hazards on Public Infrastructure in Ontario. That information is contained in our in the meeting recording. So if you didn't get a chance to watch that, attend that meeting, we can share the link again, and you can catch up on that. It was a really great discussion and a really interesting report from our colleagues at the FAO. And then we had some presentations from City of Mississauga and City of Surrey on their green infrastructure incentive programs, or stormwater incentive programs that you might find of interest, especially our municipal partners. So once again, that information would be in our recording from previous meetings. What else do I have here? Yeah, just a reminder, please use the chat to let us know about anything that you have ongoing that you'd like to share. One of the things that we are continuing to do is collect a public listing of members of the IBWG to help with, facilitate networking, that sort of thing. I believe Anna will copy a link into the chat, and if you could fill out that form, at some point we'll be ready to post our membership publicly, and that will include your interest, your organization, contact information, that sort of thing, to help other folks on the line make the right connections. And I will leave it there, and I will pass it over to Chad.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan, and good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I did want to take a moment as well to introduce Anna Murphy as our IBWG coordinator. So there's really a trio of us here, Dan and myself as co-chairs, with the unfailing support from Anna to support us also at Infrastructure Canada, like me. So the focus of today's meeting is on wildfires and what resilience strategies look like at the national and local levels. I feel a little remiss having the opportunity to introduce this topic because I'm really thankful to Dan, to your conceptualization for really conceiving this meeting and the key presenters that we're very fortunate to have join us today. I did want to set a little bit of context in terms of Canada's recent lived experience with wildfires. Even though I think it's really the forefront of our minds, it's useful to review a couple sort of key stats about this, because last summer we experienced certainly a historic wildfire season across Canada. So wildfires burned over 7 times the national annual average from late April to October, covering 15 million hectares and evacuating more than 200 communities, which reflected more than 232,000 people during the season as a whole. Quebec, the Northwest Territories, British Columbia, and Alberta all had record seasons. And contributing or inciting factors for this length of the severity of the season included an early snowmelt, drought conditions, and increased temperature of 2.2 degrees Celsius between May and October compared to the 91 to 2020 averages. As well, this kind of resulted in an unprecedented number of staff and resources dedicated to wildfire response and relief, reflecting 1,700 Canadians and 5,500 international personnel. This year, we've seen early wildfire warnings released nationwide, and again, including Quebec, Alberta, and BC. And it really highlights and underlines the importance of today's conversation. So before introducing our presenters today, I'd also like to mention that we're very pleased, and a number of people on this call and presenters have contributed to a key national guide that the National Research Council Canada led the creation of, called the Wildland Urban Interface Fires National Guide, released in 2021. And two standards are in the process of being launched to be created as a result of that guide. As well, the WUI, as we call it, Wildland Urban Interface, probably a number of people are familiar with that, WUI guide, has also informed the creation of the Fire Smart Development Best Practice Checklist, which will be integrated into Exshaw Mountain Gateway's Architectural and Landscape Guidelines. This best practice checklist makes it that much easier to target key audiences such as builders and homeowners to build climate resilient communities across the country. This guide will be included in the meeting notes from today's meeting as that rolls out. As well, I wanted to make note of FireSmart BC will be holding an in-person event on April 20th to 24th in Prince George, BC, titled Wildfire Resiliency and Training Summit, Recover, Rebuild, Prepare. This event will include 2 days of training for wildfire professionals, followed by a 3-day conference exploring lessons that we can all learn from 2023 and information to help communities prepare better for the upcoming wildfire season. A link to that will be put into the chat as well, should that be of interest, and again in our notes. So for today's session, we'll begin with we have two panels. The first session looks at the national scale, and then the second session look at the more local or regional scale. So I'll introduce the first session and hand it over to Dan. We'll have 10 minutes for questions after the presentations from 1:10 to 1:30. 2 minutes into that time already. So please do make note of anything that comes to mind that you can share later. You can enter it into the chat along the way. But now I have the pleasure of introducing our first presenter, Dr. Shanli Wang, who earned his doctorate from the Chinese Academy of Sciences and is a fire research scientist serving in the Northern Forestry Center with Natural Resources Canada's Canadian Forest Service. Dr. Wang's research is centered on better understanding and predicting the occurrence and spread of wildfires across large areas. He has developed techniques to evaluate the temporal and spatial variations of fire regimes and fire risks, which enhances the ability of operational fire management agencies to protect human life, socioeconomic values in the environment, and I'm sure infrastructure and buildings structures. He'll be followed and accompanied by Steve Taylor, a research scientist also with Natural Resources Canada, who has worked on problems in prescribed fire, smoke management, ecosystem restoration, natural disturbance dynamics, fire behavior, danger rating and risk assessment in Canada since 1985, and has contributed to fire behavior and danger projects in Australia and Argentina, and has been deployed as a fire behavior analyst and advanced planner in severe fires in British Columbia and served on national interagency advisory groups. His current research is on predicting fire occurrence and risks. So with that, I'm very fortunate to turn over the presentation, I think, to Shanli first. Thank you. I can see the presentation now.
Okay.
Oh, there we go. Oh, it's just coming. Yep. There we go. Perfect.
So this is good. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to presenting our work. And this is a effort for the last about 5 years from my research group, including many people, more than 10. This is sponsored by DRDC, Defense Research and Development Canada, for the last about 6 years. So this is the title of the this product is mapping wildfire hazard, vulnerability, and risk to Canada communities. It all started. This is a publication of this work, and so wildfire risk assessment. There are so many different ways of assessing risk in fire research. There are theoretically, you would say fire risk is a production between the likelihood of burning and impacts. But some of the kind of definition theoretically is beautiful, but practically it's not really useful. So we applied this a different twist of framework, which is fire risk is a production interaction between fire hazard and physical vulnerability. And this definition and framework works for this scale, the national scale research. For a community level scale, we may have to explore a little bit more to refine this. In order to achieve the objectives, we designed two different pathways to assess. First is a hazard, and the second is a physical vulnerability. The hazard is basically interactions between the probability, the likelihood of burning, and the intensity of the fire. For the vulnerability is the exposure plus susceptibility, and in combination of these two pathways, at the end, we are producing two types of risk assessment mapping. The first one is the community level risk, and the second is a conditional risk for potential structure. So clearly, the first one, we focus on risk around values, the value we consider that is important, community structure building. And for the conditional risk, you could say timber itself is a risk, ecosystem function is a risk. It is also value. So those can be used that way. So first thing first is the fire hazard. Fire hazard assessment, we use a model called BURN-P3. So this model considered, the stochastic aspects of fire ignitions and measure with a deterministic fire growth model that is basically the Canadian fire behavior prediction system. And we use this model to estimate the burn probability specifically for this model. So BURN-P3 model simulates the ignition and the spread of several fires for a given year. And then after you run this year, we call it one iteration. We clean the slate and we start another round of iteration. We do this for a large number of times. Normally, it's thousands of iterations. Means you are simulating thousands of years of fire burning the landscape. And then you count how many times a pixel is burned, divided that number divided by the total number of iterations. We have this so-called burn probability. So this is a measure. So BURN-P3 not only produce this burn probability is this is only part of the output. It also gives us the fire intensity, some fire behavior measurements, rate of spread. We also can retain the simulated fire polygons. So later in the presentation, I'm going to talk about this. So to simplify the inputs, we consider 4 components. Ignition, so you start a fire. For fire spread, we basically fire spread is controlled by 3 elements. It's called fire behavior triangle. The field measure is topographic. So for ignitions, we consider 2 elements. One is how many fires. Each time when you perform simulations, it will have a year. So this is based on historical distribution. And on the right side, you see this so-called ignition rate, which is control where those fires would occur. It is also based on historical ignition and ignition probabilities, basically. So fuel, before this, we didn't have a really good few layers, and Steve and others completely just redid it for the whole country. So this field is 250-meter resolution. It was the best back then, like 3 years ago. Not anymore. We have new ones right now. Topographic is easy. So measure, as for the measure part, the fire behavior triangle, so topographic and field. This is a measure. Measure we use measure to control 2 things. One, how many days a fire burn, because the number of days fire burn will decide the size of the fires. So we use this to calibrate the simulation, whether it is close to the reality or not. And another one is the daily fire weather condition, what kind of situation we have when fire is growing on the ground. So you don't have to know any of the variables. It's just a demonstration of those. So come back to this. Now we go to the first thing, the fire risk assessment. So we took 2 burn history output for fire risk assessment. The first one is burn probability, and the second is intensity, fire intensity. Because each time when fire burn a pixel, it will have a different measurement of the intensity. So we use the median value for among all those values. For burn probability, we rescale it from 0 to 100. And for the intensity, we keep them the same. But we reclass them following the so-called fire intensity classes that we use in Canada. And these 2, intensity and scaled burn probability, multiply these 2. So 1 to 6 is not only the categorical thing, it is 1 to 6 number. You multiply these 2, and we produce this combination with this C, wildfire hazard. For the hazard, we also rescale it rescale it to 0 and 100, and then we reclassify this fire hazard into 5 levels from low to extreme. So that is a hazard. It's a really rough kind of estimate for the whole country. So that is we got this map for hazard. For vulnerability, we consider exposure and susceptibility, and we consider for exposure, are you exposed to wildfires? And we give them a rate So if it is a few, you will have a high, and if not few, there's just no exposure. Building coverage is another one we used, and if there is a high is 5% because our pixel is 250 meter resolution. So it is you can't really just use the whole pixel as one big block of building. So we use this kind of percentage to do the estimate, and the location of the susceptibilities within a community in the view, which is a mixture of building structures and forest and rural areas. And then at the end, we use this fire intensity to quantify the overall vulnerability. So lower as this, you don't have to look the left, only the last column. So the lower intensity, you will rate the vulnerability lower. So this is another way of doing it. So at the end, every pixel around the communities considered, we are rating them in 5 classes. So we have the hazard and vulnerability, physical vulnerability in combinations. We produce these 2 maps. So everything is actually quite simple, straightforward. But the work behind it is just not as what I'm saying. It's just more than I was expecting. So Steve and I, at the beginning, we were thinking like 2 years we can do it. We spent 6 years to do this job. So this is the product. So first thing first, it is called conditional risk for potential structure. And you can see the high and the low. The very high, if you are familiar with the Canadian fire polygon distribution map, it actually overlap with those quite nicely. I think those are, mostly because of the really high probability. You see most frequent burn in North Alberta, Saskatchewan, Eastern Ontario, Northwest Territory, those kind of places. They always have higher frequency of fires, so burn probability is high. And because this doesn't concern the communities, clearly those you will see the pattern. For the built-up locations, this is all about all those communities, and you see the north and south trend of the coloring. So in the north, you see higher, more severe burn fire risk, and in the south, because it is close to the built-up cities and agriculture around this area, risk is close to 0. So it's quite low, basically. So in summarize, we found that there are more than 4 million buildings in the forest here in Canada, and about half of them directly exposed to fires. And but the high and very high is about 6.3%. Seems quite low, but you are talking about 291,000 buildings that is surrounded with very high risk, and extremely high areas are more than 10,000. That's a lot to us even. For people population, we have 30 million people live in forestry Canada, and about 2.7 live in high risk areas, and that is like more than a quarter million people, and about 30,000 lives in very high risk areas. That is a big concern for us. And among those highs, we found a lot of them are living under reserves. So the indigenous people are affected living in higher fire risk area in comparisons to other communities. So that is something expected, but it's quite striking too to find all these things. This is the product we produced. I'm not going to bother you with this. Take home messages and some technical summaries. So I'm going to go to the next one. Stephen and I and another group of people, we go a little bit deeper into how to use the output from this effort. So we did this kind of mapping this fire shed, fire pathway, and fire spread distance. So we published this paper recently, and so based on the output from this project, we could have those fire polygons around each of the community, and the area around the community from fire could ignite and reach to the community. We keep those fire sheds, and then we can delineate, the area around the community. We call those fire shed. Fire shed is a concept similar to watershed. That water flow to the same, a specific location. They converge to one location, and the converging point in fire shed is a community. So that's what it is. Fire pathway is the route between ignition and the quickest way to get into the community. So this the two things, and we also delineate the distance for how many hours actually burning fire could reach our communities. We did this for 1980 communities across Canada. So I'm going to have make another presentation Wildfire Canada in a few weeks. So if anybody is interested, you can go there, and we are going to introduce this in more details. And the biggest, one of the most interesting discoveries is that these two columns from the left is real ignition, simulated ignitions, and on the right side, we just random select those ignition point everywhere, and we do find this kind of fire pathway, where fire comes to the community. They have directions. They don't come from random locations. They always have directions. There are certain pathways that fire could always go there. Is something like that. And this is one example as Yellowknife last year. So those little gray shaded area, the fire polygons last year, and that pink is the fire shed, and the red is a Yellowknife. You see that fire, the biggest fire, made all Yellowknife evacuated. That is the one right on the fire side, almost right on the fire side we plotted, and that was just striking to us. I have to say this is one. There are other examples. They don't really work as good as this one, but this one it was live. My co-author, Tom Sweston, on the day when it was burning, he just mapped them, and it looked really interesting. So that is everything. Am I on time?
Yeah, no, that's great. We're about two minutes into our question period which I have about 10 minutes for questions. But I mean, Steve, maybe you can participate in answering any questions too, or offer your comments. Thank you very much, Shannon Lee. This is really informative, really insightful, and I think mind-opening to those of us who are not as familiar with this work. Wow, I didn't know the word fire shed before today. This is really intriguing. Are there questions at this point? You can either put your hands up or sort of have a limited view here from my angle. And if you see people that we're overlooking, please also shout out. But at this point, I mean, I have a question that comes to mind, and that I think about moisture content and sort of the aridity. And you mentioned, I saw weather at one corner of the triangle, Charlie, and I just think that must be an interesting and dynamic aspect of this model. Exactly, right there in that lower left corner, the aridity or I don't know, relative moisture, which ties to heat, of course, must be an important aspect of this work. But you know what? Before I really surface that fully, I do want to say, Steve, you've been really kind enough to join us today, and you work in this domain with Shanley. Is there comments that you'd like to offer at this juncture?
Yeah, I won't take up, thanks, Chad. I won't take up too much time. Just a couple of maybe interpretive comments. So, in the fire discipline, like other disciplines, we kind of have our own language that sometimes makes it, harder to follow. But some of these concepts are really quite basic. So, in the burn P3 modeling, Shang Li's talking about, essentially we're trying to model event sets. So that's a concept that's used in other areas of catastrophic loss modeling. So we're trying to use our understanding of how fires behave in relation to moisture and fuels and other conditions, and represent that range of possibilities, and model a very large set of possible fire events. And those give us the burn probability, as well as this notion of fire shed. Those are essentially the fires that would reach a community. So, related to that hazard at a community level, that fire shed is really a source area on the landscape. That's really what's controlling the hazard at the community, as the sort of the size and nature of that source area. And that's a concept that's used in other areas around, we can think of a flood source area or a seismic source area. So these are not, there's nothing special about these concepts. They're, familiar from other areas of hazard modeling.
No, it's very helpful. I mean, in our work at Infrastructure Canada, we also have a mandate letter for our minister, which says in those communities most at risk, prioritize for resilience investments to take action. And so the degree that we can apply our sort of forward-looking knowledge to see where the risks are greater, so that we can foster those investments nationally, but that create the level of preparedness that's needed, that is truly valuable. It's always, I think, a question about predicting the future is no easy task, yet we need to be forward-looking, very much so. So, Dan, I see your hand has gone up.
Yeah, and I'm checking for hands here in the participant list here, but two questions for Shanley and for Steve. So one question is about the role of suppression. So Shanley, you had some charts there about escape fires. And I think there's like an assumption that there's a fire in the landscape, suppression resources are deployed to control the fire, to reduce risk of it affecting a community. And could you highlight, whether suppression is incorporated into this work, and how it affects vulnerability or risk as identified or as characterized in your work? So that's one question, the role of suppression. The other one is, can you share some info about the characteristics of fire pathways? Are these largely related to fuel, to topography, or a combination of both? That would be interesting to know as well.
Okay, I will try to answer the first question. I think Steve has a better idea than I do. So the answer to the question is that fire suppression is not directly considered in this exercise. It is quite impossible in the modeling work. But we did, because of our calibration of fire simulations, we use the final fire sizes, and we use the real fire durations as the distribution for input. So it is kind of indirectly incorporate. That's the end product fire actually burned how much. That is actually another thing that a lot of the time the fire weather environment and fire activity itself, like sizes and the numbers, they don't follow this really strong relationship. This is a part of this. I know Steve has better other thoughts on this. I'm going to just so the second question is about
pathways.
Pathways is based on the burn P3 output. One is the rate of spread kind of grades. It is underneath the grade, and the other one is the fire polygon. So when we do the simulations, we can retain the fire polygon, the fire scars, and we know where the simulation point is. And the end point is going to be the community. We know this fire because we pick to the fire that reached the community boundary. And then we try to follow the quickest pathway the fire could reach to the community. For risk and for prevention, that is the most we want to know the worst scenario. So that's how it was done. Steve, you have anything to add?
I could just add a little bit to the pathways. Yeah, they're very much, in most cases, related to what we call fuels, which is vegetation. So different kinds of vegetation have different fire spread at different rates and different types of vegetation under different weather conditions. We have models in Canada for that and elsewhere. So fire spreads very quickly, say through black spruce, much more slowly through green trembling aspen. And so the fire pathways are really kind of a least cost route from the landscape to the boundary of the community. And it's really linking up patches of highly flammable fuel.
That's very helpful. It gives a sense of agency, right? If we can alter the types of vegetation, perhaps we can alter the rate at which a fire pathway.
Well, that's the thought, yeah. In the example that Shang Li gave for Yellowknife, that is, a good deal of that is controlled by fuel, because you get further north there, you're right on the shield, and the fuel gets very spotty. So the pathways there are just very strongly controlled by the fuel availability.
Yeah, for the other part of the country, if communities are surrounded by all fields or all surrounded by forest, the weather condition is going to play ignition location distribution of human activities. Those where it is started and how the wind blow the fire, and that actually take control in some of the communities. Not always, but for our community, you only have a limited kind of connections to fuel. Fuel is going to determine if the fire start there, it will come to your community through that rate. So it is not one factor controlling everything. That is what we learn from this exercise. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's very true. And Dan, we're going to turn over to you now, I think, to take the next session. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Steve Janley, and just your work is really quite incredible and very helpful to help us understand vulnerability of communities across Canada fire, and this kind of information wasn't necessarily readily available before, so it's really very important work, and thanks a lot for all of your work on the topic. And we can share if there are other supporting resources, Janley and Steve. So we have identified the one paper, but if there's additional papers, let's include those in the notes to make sure people can have access to those as well. And I'm sure we'll turn back to you with questions in the future, but thank you again. So next we have Kelly Johnson. So Kelly Johnson is a wildfire specialist based in British Columbia. He has 34 years of experience in urban and wildfire response, prescribed fire risk assessment, and community wildfire risk reduction. Kelly maintains his qualifications as a chief fire officer, a registered professional forester, and a wildland fire behavior analyst. He currently applies his knowledge and skills across North America as principal of BC-based Wildfire Professional Solutions Incorporated. He is the co-founder and operations director of the Colorado-based nonprofit Community Wildfire Planning Center. He's a structure protection specialist with the BC Wildfire Service and fire chief of Apex Fire Rescue. So thanks very much, Kelly. I will hand it over to you.
There, how was that? I'm off mute. Good. Thanks, Dan. So I think you've heard a lot of really good and very complicated, but as Steve put it, he thinks it's simple on how they've calculated everything on how fire behaves on the landscape. And what I'm going to do is sort of bring it down to how that interacts with some of the primary values that we're concerned with. And mainly we hear many years, every year in a row, including last year with all of of homes burning and structures burning. So we're going to talk how fire translates to that environment, to within the wildland-urban interface. And this photo is actually a photo of the area that I'm responsible for, the fire service, and where I live. And this was in 2022, and we were evacuated this is what many communities faced and face more and more as we move through into the future. So the first thing I wanted to cover is just, we talked a little bit, there was the discussion about the wildland-urban interface and the idea that it's, this interaction between human development and the natural environment, vegetation. And what we're really trying to get at is, and what we're really trying to understand is that it's actually a combined, what we call a combined fuel complex. And it's the conditions of those of that fuel complex. You heard from Steve and Shanley about the conditions of vegetation, and what we really want to sort of impose or impress upon folks is that condition of the combustibility actually extends right across the landscape, including the built environment, or what we refer to as the built environment. And you can see here from this concept coined by Dr. Jack Cohen from the U.S. Forest Service, the wildland-urban interface disaster sequence, where we have wildland fire, escaping what we call initial attack, entering into the built environment, and starting to burn structures and infrastructure. And just a note that across Canada, across North America, and much of the world, we're very good at what we call initial attack. We're so good at it. We're about 95% effective of stopping fires before they escape, get bigger than 10 hectares. And so these are a small percentage of fires that are doing this damage or growing this large, but they are occurring more frequently. This turns into what we call an urban conflagration, where we get multiple simultaneous ignitions of structures. So it's not just one building at a time, it's 10, 20, 100, 200 buildings being ignited all at the same time, and therefore overwhelming the resources, overwhelming those fire suppression resources, which Shane Lee was very, when that question was asked about incorporating fire suppression, this is one of those challenges. Is it's really difficult to quantify, particularly in the wildland-urban interface. And therefore, so what these definitions, the spatial definition of what the wildland-urban interface is actually describing is any developed area where the conditions that affect the combustibility of both the wildland and the built fuel allow for the ignition and spread of that fire through that combined fuel complex. So when we say complex, we mean complex because it is very complex. It's the wildland fuels that that you heard about on how fire behavior and how we understand that's burning and moving into that built environment and the structures and fire moving between that combined assortment of fuels. So it describes both the vegetation and the structures as fuel and has to consider things like that fire behavior triangle and the fire risk triangle with the topography and weather conditions that are influencing the fire and its behavior. So some of the research that sort of started this was started in the International Crown Fire Modeling Experiment that took place near Fort Providence in Northwest Territories in the mid-90s. And Dr. Cohen actually was part of that, where he placed a number of structures out next to these large fuel plots that were eventually ignited, and different aspects of fire behavior were observed and recorded. And he recorded what happened to these structures when they burned across or were exposed to this intensity of fire, this crown fire. And so they placed these walls that were next to the crown fire, and you can see the scale with these photos and the size, just small walls with some sensors in them, wood walls that the intent was to measure the impact of both radiant and convective heat on these walls. And in 3 of the 5 burns, with no flame contact, there was the 10-meter walls received scorch. So the walls at 10 meters from these crown fires received scorch, and the 20 and 30-meter walls received no scorch. And so that was in these situations where there was no convective heat or winds pushing the flames around. But it was noted that, you know, with these large fires, they always generate their own wind, and they start pushing flames around sideways rather than straight up, and extend that heat impact out horizontally. And so in 2 of the burns where this occurred, where flame contact occurred, they saw the 10-meter wall sections would ignite with flame contact, and the 20-meter wall sections received light scorch, but the 30-meter wall sections still received no scorch. And so a key observation from that was also that the fires only lasted about 50 seconds at any given point. So those walls were only exposed to that heat for about 50 seconds. And so they self-extinguished after the fire moved through. And where that was the only heat they were exposed to, where a typical wood wall would require about 5 minutes of heating for it to be sustainably ignited. So all of this was found in that research. The one thing that wasn't tested in that research was the impact of embers, which we now know that embers account for a large majority of structure ignitions. So the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety took this one step further, built a large house in a wind tunnel in South Carolina, and created ember generators. And that's the only heat that the homes were exposed to, was these ember generators. So no radiant or convective heat from crown fire. And they really looked at the building construction vulnerabilities to these embers and the immediate area around the building and what would happen. And they managed to burn the house down in the end. But they did find some really interesting observations between different types of building materials and the presence of vegetation and organic material directly adjacent to the home. So just a little review on how all of this heat affects a home is there's 3 different heat transfer processes. There's radiant heat, convective heat, and conductive heat. Radiant heat extends out in all directions from a heat source, and it decreases with distance. So it's typically shorter than the effects of convective heat. convective heat, typically in a world with no wind and no slope and no physics where fire would create its own wind, convective heat would typically go straight up. We'd see it rising, moving, rising or being pushed. And what we do see though is that because of those winds, it does get pushed downwind or upslope if it's on a slope. So with that, we're getting heat rising, but we're also getting embers rising with that heat. So the embers are being pushed up with that convective air up into the air, up into the wind field, and then the embers are carried horizontally through the wind field for some distance and dropped onto the structures where, if there is vulnerable components of the structure, combustible components of the structure, they'll ignite the structure through conduction. So direct heat contact, direct burning material to susceptible material contact. And ironically, the ember forecasting, what you heard in the previous presentation was there was a lot of relationship between radiant and convective heat that we know very much, and we can actually predict fairly well with the translation to flame length and heat outputs from different types of fuels. But the embers are a little trickier with modeling, and so we do know that we've had ember impacts for 2 kilometers or even greater this past season in some areas. And so we also know that most of the structure losses that we've found are from ember impacts. So that has led everything to what we call the home ignition zone, where we've created the immediate zone, which is out to 1.5 meters, the intermediate zone, which is out to 10 meters, and the extended zone out to 30 meters. And these zones were created based on that relationship that Dr. Cohen found with the radiant and convective heat, as well as the immediate zone, particularly with the ember impacts. And the home ignition zone also includes the building itself. So with the concept of mitigating in the home ignition zone and using this as guidance, there's been a number of case studies that have followed up on structure losses and structure survival, and whether and how accurate and how successful that this concept is. And it actually has come out with some pretty good correlations between the science of the home ignition zone and what we're seeing out on the landscape after fires. So you can see here, there was in 2012, there was the Waldo Canyon fire in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and a few other case studies, a couple of which I was involved in, where we did find that if people actually mitigated their home ignition zone, then there was a pretty high probability of survival with the structures. I do want to say that we've struggled for a long time because of this ember impact, and because the different designs of the buildings and the different placements of buildings and the different conditions that are on the site. There hasn't been a way that we've been able to model this where we can put it on a spatial map and say, we know that this house is susceptible and this one isn't, by running it through some sort of modeling formula. We can get the exposure, as you've heard, but we can't predict necessarily without doing what we call a boots on the ground assessment of these homes, on how susceptible they are to fire. So I also wanted to point out that in order to be successful with these assessments, that homeowner and community involvement is key. Not only does it create an opportunity for outreach and education, but it actually the social science tells us that there's long-term behavioral change if people are involved and we relate the science and what we know directly to something that they care about. And in the end, it empowers the homeowners to take these measurable wildfire risk reduction opportunities on the property that they're concerned with. And then, of course, there's a number other than structure loss directly. There's a number of other outcomes that link strongly to economic outcomes and economic changes in these communities. Any post-fire follow-up will see that many of these communities that have had significant losses have immediate losses that have also had significant long-term economic and social impacts. So one of the examples of an assessment system that incorporates all of this is the British Columbia Fire Smart program, the Home Partners program being run in British Columbia. So how does the assessment get carried out? It starts with, as I said, a boots on the ground. We call it top to bottom and walls out approach. So working from the roof, which is the most typically, if it's a combustible roof, it's the most vulnerable component of the house. And then moving down the walls and working out from the building itself out to that 30 meters. We look at things like the roof, the type, the condition, the complexity, debris on the roof, the gutters, as mostly if they're combustible or non-combustible gutters, and if they have contents in the gutters, vents, typically if they're screened small enough to keep embers out of the openings like attics or crawl spaces. The walls, typically if they're combustible or non-combustible. And we've also found that there's a pretty important correlation with having a 6-inch vertical space, non-combustible space between the grade and the bottom of the wall. The windows, we know that single pane windows are more susceptible. Under enclosed floor spaces, other openings like dog doors or any openings that allow embers into the house, and in particular things like decks and other attachments to the house that could be made out of combustible material are very susceptible. So looking at the structures, even things like furniture with cushions that are made out of hydrocarbons sitting in the wrong place on a deck can be the result, can end in home burning down, or the storage of materials, or even little tiny details like pine needles or pine cones piled underneath an enclosed space where the embers can enter. So we moved from the home to the immediate zone, which is that 1.5 meters around. And what we found that it's extremely important to have that as a non-combustible space with no combustibles there. That will lead to that short distance radiant heat transfer to the home. That's become a very important piece. So things like mulches and landscape timbers and people storing things next to their homes increases the vulnerability significantly. Moving out to the intermediate zone, or the 10 meters around the home, again, things that can produce slightly more radiant or convective heat, like conifers, highly flammable shrubs, firewood, things like that can provide that heat flux that can either ignite walls or break windows and allow embers to enter the building are important things to deal with. And into the extended zone, which is out to that 30-meter zone, there has to be consideration for topography to ensure that that convective heat doesn't come into play too much. And when we talk about that with homes, it's the setbacks on the homes that we're really worried about. Those homes that are hanging over or very close to edges and can take that convective heat with full force. The surface fuels like deep accumulations of pine needles or organic materials, they lead to the transfer of heat into flame length, which can extend up into the crowns of the trees and create that crown fire scenario with that big influence of radiant heat within 30 meters. Making sure that we've separated the crowns from the tree crowns from the surface fuels to mitigate that as much as possible. In addition to the vegetation in those areas, we're really looking at things like how are people storing firewood or lumber or other combustible items. And you can see here in some of the photos that there's a lot of opportunity for embers and fire to spread towards the structure. So mitigating that is important. I mentioned propane tanks in here. Propane tanks actually are quite fire resilient as long as they don't have a heat source around them to cause them to vent. If they do vent, they turn into giant blowtorches. So keeping the heat away from propane tanks will actually change outcomes, which propane tanks are pretty prevalent in many rural areas. So moving out to the community level, as far as vegetation management, the vegetation management at the community level is gone more from looking after that home ignition zone to supporting fire suppression, reducing the fire behavior that you heard about earlier to a level that fire resources can actually do something. What we find is that those extreme those extreme fire behavior events are at a level that any of our suppression tactics or capabilities, other than backing way off and lighting a fire, are largely unsuccessful, and firefighters can't be there. It's too dangerous. So changing that environment through fuel treatment so firefighters can be in and around the community and actually do their job is important. And of course, things like ecological objectives have to be incorporated in that, so we don't create some worse forest health conditions than we have already. And considering things like other hazards like landslides or flooding because of the aggressive removal of vegetation. And probably the biggest point is that it has to be understood that this is maintained. Vegetation is dynamic and it grows and changes over time. And we go in once, we're not finished. Two other important aspects from the community aspect of things are access and egress for firefighters. So making sure that there's ways for firefighters to get in and people to get out at the same time if they're being evacuated. And fire trucks and equipment are heavy, so the roads have to be able to handle that. The roads have to have grades that those big trucks can climb and get around safely. There has to be signage there that's non-combustible, so the firefighters that are coming from outside of the area know where they're going. And the bridges have to be able to hold those heavy pieces of equipment as well. And then finally, the water supply, making sure that there's an adequate water supply in a community that can support the fire suppression operations. And with that, some things that aren't thought of but happens quite often is that the water supply infrastructure is protected from the wildfire impacts itself, and there's power backup. Power is typically either purposely shut down or ends up failing because of power poles burning through or something like that happening. And if the water supply is powered by the power supply, the firefighters lose the water supply, which happens on most wildland-urban interface events. So with that, I can open it up to any questions if there's time.
Great, thank you, Kelly. There is time for a couple of questions, so feel free to unmute yourself and start speaking or raise your hand. We'll get to you. I have a couple thoughts while we're waiting for questions. So Jenny and Steve presented at sort of the broad scale, maybe more generalized exposure to wildfire risk in Canada. And Kelly's highlighted for us community level considerations. So that the general assessment gives us an indication of where we should think about wildfire risk in Canada. But if we really need to understand how to mitigate risk at the community level, at the building level, you have to understand the community itself, the fuel conditions, the buildings, even site conditions like, debris on the site and so on. A question for you, Kelly, is, so you work in Canada, in the US. To what extent are we, I suppose, able to assess community level vulnerability to fire and make recommendations? I know there's several small, I think relatively small consulting groups, kind of like similar to what the work that you do, that do these types of assessments for communities, but I don't think it's conducted sort of nationally. What's required to get a good understanding of community vulnerability nationally? And if we don't have that understanding, what are some approaches that we can apply at a broader scale to mitigate risk?
Well, I think that, using the science that was presented to you in the first presentation brings the fire to the community. And you can scale that down to, a more finite scale at a community level to understand, using the micro topography and fuel and the specific fuels. And that presents an exposure of, here's the heat and here's the potential ember impact to a community. When you're talking about the community vulnerability from that perspective, we are really looking at the home ignition zone, which is what we just talked about. Essentially, the further apart the homes are, the less influence they have on each other, but the closer together they are, the more dependent they are on each other for each of those home ignition zones being appropriately mitigated. So it's kind of a balancing act of the further apart they are, it's also harder to provide appropriate fire suppression support. But definitely, as we're seeing through land use development patterns, the need to create higher density development areas, it's going to become more and more important to understand that they're interlinked with each other, and therefore all of these factors will determine whether if there's one weak link in that community, that has to be addressed. Otherwise, it will be a vulnerability to the entire community, no matter what everyone else does in the community. So it is, as I said earlier, the unfortunate part is there has been structure density research done with regard. NIST has done some structure density research as far as structure to structure ignition, but that's really once one structure gets going, how vulnerable the structures are based on their separation. It boils down to that boots on the ground assessment to translate that exposure of what's happening in the vegetation to what could happen in the built environment.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Elise Bray, you have a comment?
There we go, unmuted. Hey, Kelly, I'm in Roslyn, BC, and so this is feeling very close to home. An amazing presentation. The question I have is coming from a design perspective. You were just talking about housing separation, and right now, as we're going through, this affordable housing, and we're looking at adding more density to communities. Currently the design guidelines basically go under the Fire Underwriters Survey recommendations for housing separation. Do you think some of the work that's coming out now is going to be recommending to start increasing some of that separation? Or is it just, changing materials if you're going that close, or openings between houses, or do you get involved in that level of policy detail at all?
Yeah, so there's two pieces to that. One is the piece of the fire moving from the wildlands into the interface, and the home ignition zone piece of what's around the house. And then the second part is, as far as as you said, the separation between the homes, and of course there would have to be, increased increased fire ratings on windows and walls and all that to stop or to reduce the potential for one home igniting another. So the two things that I think would have to be in place for that higher density is to somehow have some mechanism in place to compel each homeowner to take care of their home ignition zone so they don't become that weak point. And then of course, the actual building code requirements for the structure separation for window sizes and glass type and non-combustible siding and non-combustible construction and design in that. So one is is basically to ensure that homes don't become the ignition point, and then the second part is making sure they're less susceptible to the next home.
Yeah, thanks.
Great, thanks, Elise, and thanks, Kelly. I think we're gonna have to move on. We've got about 15 minutes left, but Kelly, thank you very much for a great presentation. It's something we certainly need to learn more about, and I'm sure we'll turn back to you for more information in the future. I know there's ongoing work in Canada and different communities at this scale. Notably in Lytton, there's some work going on in terms of application of the NRC WUI Fire Guide recommendations, and there's growing interest, notably in BC and Alberta, on with respect to application of these community level measures. So it's a growing area of interest. So it's really good to hear from you, Kelly. And like I said, hopefully we can turn back to you with questions in the future. So thanks again, Kelly. So we're going to transition to another section on the agenda, which is updates from IBWG members. So Marianne Armstrong is here. She's going to give us an update from her side on some specific initiatives. I have a couple of updates from the PIVC program. If there's anybody else who would like a couple of minutes to share important initiatives, anything you'd like to share with this group, this would be the time to share, or you could include in the chat. But we might make this a more regular part of these sessions, giving IBWG members a chance to share what they're working on, important developments for the community. But first, we're going to hand it over to Marianne.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Chad, for inviting me to share a few words. I had the privilege of going to Paris earlier on this month for the UN Buildings and Climate Global Forum. So a bit of insight into what's going on the global stage that I would like to share with you today. I also have a few links, so I'll be pasting those in the chat as I give you this update. The first thing I want to mention is that Dan and I have both been participating in the Global ABC Working Group on Adaptation. And a major thing came out of that group, which is we just published what we called a call for action that talks to why are we not adapting and what can the different players along the chain do. So I'm going to paste you a link there in the chat for that one. You have to scroll down the page to find it. But this group is quite active and is going to be rebranded as a UN Resilience Hub. And we'll be looking to establish priorities for action and a roadmap on adaptation. So exciting news there, certainly. So more interest really globally on resilience. Obviously, there's still a lot of discussion on mitigation, and that was really the focus for the UN Buildings and Climate Global Forum. There, I was there to represent the resilience side. I participated on the 2 panels that were on resilience over 2 days. But really decarbonization was still the major focus. And there's really a big reason behind that is that we're not meeting the targets that were set out, but I'll speak to that in 2 seconds. Really the conversations here were about how do we ensure that the Global South is supported in building sustainable and resilient construction. One big takeaway is that the number of buildings in the world is set to double by 2050. And that's mostly going to be occurring in the Global South. So how can we ensure that they have the funding, the technology, the knowledge to ensure that they're building resilient and sustainable buildings and housing? Another part of the conversation was about urban design. So going beyond the building, which is nice to hear, especially in the context of resilience. We've been speaking this way. You heard about some of the the community level measures on wildfire, for example, today, but really that understanding in the global level that to achieve our resilience and sustainability goals, we have to look beyond the building to the way that we are designing our communities. In terms of Canada, Canada is certainly leading as far as I can tell on building resilience with our national adaptation strategy, with the work that we've been undertaking on codes and standards, certainly. Other areas we heard about, France is quite active on preventing overheating, having experienced heat waves themselves, as well as dry clay retreat, which is an interesting one where clay is pulling away from the foundations of buildings and causing that to be a problem. We obviously heard from some of the Pacific Island nations that are having issues with sea level rise, concerns around that, as well as from some cities in the river delta, including Bangladesh, as well as the city of Alexandria. We're quite concerned with that. The US, as some of you are aware, is following our lead on looking towards the future climate data and making sure that their codes are climate resilient. So that's good. We're able to share some of our practices with them. And we also heard from Holland at the forum too, in terms of their work on flooding and sponge cities. So some movement globally, but not a lot. Like I've been working in this space for 8 years, as many of you. So it's good to hear the word resilience spoken. I'm hoping that more action comes about as this moves forward. I'm going to paste for you just a few documents and major reports on resilience that you might want to check out. And I'll put those in the chat as well. And then I also want to share with you that there's a new status report that came out from UNEP as well, the United Nations Environment Program, for the buildings and construction sector. And so that's this next link. Okay. And what this really says is that we are missing our targets on mitigation by a lot. They're saying we're basically building as fast as we are reducing. So we wanted to see a large reduction in this sector, and we're not seeing it. So as a result of that, and so if you want to learn more about how the building sector is doing, please check out that report. But as a result of that, the main purpose of the UN Forum was actually to develop the Déclaration de Chaillot. So the Déclaration de Chaillot was signed by 70 different countries, and it is their commitment to working together towards different objectives. And I'll talk to those, and that'll be my last thing today. But it really is about establishing a pathway to decarbonization and resilience for buildings. And so the main objectives of that are integrated urban planning, aiming at greater resilience, efficiency, and sufficiency, things such as reducing urban sprawl, using nature-based solutions, promoting mixed-use spaces, as well as the interactions between buildings and urban spaces. And then the second objective is on construction and retrofitting, which includes climate resilience. Great to see that there. Prioritizing reuse and repurpose of existing buildings and infrastructure, passive performance, local materials, circular economy, carbon absorption, electrification, minimizing waste, and ensuring local grids and sufficiency. So some really interesting things in that Déclaration de Chaillot. That will be the last link I share with you. And Canada is among those countries that signed La Déclaration. So looking to accelerate those efforts, particularly on the decarbonization space, to try to achieve our targets. But it is a very steep road. So if you do look at that status report, the global status report, you'll realize how far off we are from those 2050 targets in this sector. So hopefully something will come from the Déclaration de Chaillot to accelerate that. But certainly our work on adaptation and resilience is important, and we're seeing some acceleration of that on the global stage. So that's tried to be brief, but there's a lot there. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Marianne. It's great. It's great to hear. It's great to hear where we stand nationally compared to our international colleagues on this topic. However, lots of work to do, as you're stating. So I'm not seeing other hands up. So I'm just going to go quickly over some PIVC updates. And if you do have anything to share, just please do put your hand up, and we'll get to you before the end of the meeting. So I think most people on the line here are familiar with the PIVC program, but really quick, I'm not going to belabor this presentation. Really quick outline. PIVC stands for Public Infrastructure Engineering Vulnerability Committee. This is a committee that was struck by Engineers Canada with support from NRCan in 2005. They were tasked with developing approaches, methods for assessing vulnerability of engineered buildings and infrastructure to the potential impacts of climate change. This program's been running since 2005. In 2020, the program was assumed by a collaboration of 3 organizations: Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, Climate Risk Institute, and GIZ, part of the German International Development Agency, that have been using this method for their international projects. So we assumed this program in 2020 after it was developed by Engineers Canada starting in 2005. And we've also have partnerships with the Ontario First Nations Technical Services Corporation and the Professional Association of Engineers and Architects of Costa Rica, who are involved in deploying PIBC methods with their constituents. Some of the features of the PIBC program: a core activity of the PIBC program is developing resources for practitioners to assess the vulnerability of engineered structures and buildings to the impacts of climate change. We offer these resources for free at no cost. We are nonprofit organizations that are running this program. Another core function is that we publish assessment reports. So when there has been a PIBC assessment report completed, we work our very hardest to collect those assessment reports and publish them on the pibc.ca website. There's about 100 reports published there. And there have been hundreds of assessments done over the years with PIBC resources. So there are some of the core resources in the PIBC program. We have the PIBC protocol, which is the core sort of PIBC assessment process, the high-level screening guide, which is sort of an expedited version of the protocol, the First Nations Infrastructure Resilience Toolkit, which includes a version of the PIBC protocol that has been developed by Ontario First Nations Technical Services Corporation, and several other supporting resources. This is the kind of work that the PIBC program gets involved in. Recently, we signed an MOU with Infrastructure Canada that provided the PIBC Alliance funding to develop 2 projects. One was an update of the full PIBC protocol, so a full sort of revamping and update of that core resource that was developed starting with Engineers Canada in 2005. This is the first major update in about 6 to 8 years since we assumed the program. Some of the objectives of the update: first, we wanted to retain the core PIBC process. A lot of organizations, consulting companies, government agencies have sort of integrated that PIBC process into ongoing work. So we needed to stay very close to that initial process, but update the supporting information and context. We wanted to respond to user feedback and feedback from our large sort of PIBC community of users and interested parties that are involved in the PIBC program. We also wanted to align and relate the core PIBC protocol with some of the newer resources that we produced, including the high-level screening guide, PIBC Green, a large portfolio assessment manual that have been all released in the last couple of years. Also, the updated PIBC protocol is much clearer on how it relates to other standards in the field, like ISO 31000, the ISO 14090 standards. Terminology is aligned, and the place of the PIBC protocol in those standards is also much more clearly articulated in the updated version of the protocol. There's new explanatory materials, and importantly, there is a streamlining of the content. So material that we found people are not really using that much or was a bit verbose, coming out of a different era of climate change adaptation when it was newer to the community, that's been removed or simplified or moved to annexes to make the core document much easier to read. And of course, we'll be translating into French and graphic design and all that sort of stuff. We had a lot of input from a project advisory committee, and also we had a number of interviews with highly experienced practitioners that all fed directly into the updating of the protocol. We're at a near final technical draft. We're still going to go through translation and graphic design, but currently we have 5 volumes. Volume 1 is a detailed user guide. Volume 2 is supplement and support for the user guide. There's a step-by-step instruction manual, a very, very high-level field guide, and also a vocabulary document. These are all developed in response to user comments about usability of the existing protocol. The idea is to make the protocol much more usable. And also something that's become clear to us throughout the update process is that the privacy protocol should be viewed as a living document. It will require periodic updating. That's just going to be a matter of course, or it's going to be necessary to make sure that we're responding to community needs. So that's one output, is an updated privacy protocol that will be released by early June. The final version is due May 31st, and we hope to have that ready for the community in early June. And then also we're publishing a meta assessment, an assessment of historical privacy assessment reports. There's about 70 to 85 reports that have been assessed. So that will identify common findings, data gaps, common future climate scenarios across infrastructure types across Canada. And as part of that work, there'll be 13 detailed case studies of about 8 to 10 pages each. And all of this is meant to create a resource for privacy protocol users to help them understand the process in previous assessments. And we also had a lot of input from an advisory committee and interviews in that work as well. I'm going to leave it there. Watch for those updates in your reports, and hopefully they'll be of value to this group. We're at 2:30. I'm going to pass it over to Chad for a quick wrap up.
Thank you so much. Really, the biggest things I can say, most important, is thank you to our presenters, Shane Lee, Steve Taylor, Kelly Johnson. Thank you to all of you for being here and present with us and continuing to find value in IBWG. Thank you to Anna Murphy, our coordinator, and we always welcome your input, your comments. Our next meeting is scheduled for June 11th. Put that in the chat. And we welcome new members to join this group. So hopefully you've seen the member directory link in the chat, and you're welcome to add your name if you're not there, or invite others to join us. Thanks again for being here with us.
Thank you, everyone.